We are very pleased to have the very patient Amanda Delola here today to present to us. Amanda just arrived at the University of Minnesota this semester. She came to us from the University of South Carolina. She's associate professor in the linguistics program, and she's the director of the CLA Language Center. And today she is giving a presentation called You Are What You Tweet, Decoding Speaker Identity and Fricative Epithesis on French Language Twitter. So please welcome Amanda.
So my name is Amanda, you she, I'll pronounce if you still use Twitter, because it's kind of a question right now. You're welcome to tweet about this presentation at me using that handle. You can also tweet at Carla, they're on there too. But you can also reach out to me after the presentation if you like the slides by email. So before we get started, I want to just give a grand merci with a big fricative at the end of it to Carla for inviting me to participate in this talk series, also to my team at the CLA Language Center, and also my colleagues at the Institute of Linguistics. So what we're talking about today is formally called phrase final fricative epithesis, and even for a very patient sociophonetician, that's a lot of syllables. So we're going to actually just abbreviate it PFFE from here on out. It's also actually known as phrase final vowel devoicing, so if you spend a little bit of time looking at the sociolinguistics and sociophonetics of French, you've probably heard it described as that. It's the same thing. What it amounts to is essentially these sharp phrase final whistles that you get at the end of a phrase. So if you're familiar with French, you can have, French, 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 and at the end of an intonation you get like the word nuit. There's no fricative on that. You could pronounce it with the fricative as minuit, that little bit of hiss. Entendu, entendu, and beaucoup, beaucoup, right? So what we're dealing with here is, you maybe can hear that the fricative isn't always the same, it sounds slightly different. We won't talk about the differences in the acoustics, but there are some, and this is the sound that I'm trying to characterize here. So here is a clip that I'll share with you. You don't need to know French to understand what's going on. I want you to listen for this hiss. The phrase you're listening for is à la reine du parapluie, so to the queen of umbrellas. The scenario here is a man comes back from a vacation and he gifts his wife an umbrella, and as he presents, or actually it's like a piece of jewelry, and as he presents it to her, he calls her this. See if you can hear the fricative. I don't know how loud this is going to be.
Robert, alors c'est vrai ce qu'on m'a dit, tu es rentré?
Je débarque à la minute.
Oh, moi qui voulais fêter ton retour en grande pompe.
J'ai voulu te faire une petite surprise. Et d'ailleurs, j'ai rapporté un cadeau de Grèce à la reine du parapluie.
Tu as pensé à moi?
Dis donc, t'as changé la déco?
Oui, j'ai rajouté un peu de couleur.
So that was an instance of a man using it with a woman. Here we have an instance of two men using it. There's a man off screen that you'll recognize. The scenario here is a little bit different. They're talking about what they're eating for lunch, so it's super banal. But there's a scenario where the man off screen has been accused of being mean to the man on screen, and he wants to make nice with him. So what he's trying to do here is manipulate his pronunciation to do so. There are no subtitles on this, and I'll translate it. It's not really riveting, but here we go.
Tu manges des betteraves?
You're eating beets?
Oui.
Yeah.
C'est bon pour la santé.
They're good for your health.
Moi, j'ai pris des carottes râpées.
I had shredded carrots.
Ah bon?
Oh, really?
C'est bon aussi les carottes râpées pour la santé.
They're also good for your health.
Oui. Mais je vais en prendre aussi.
I'm going to have some too. Now listen, use the phrase.
Des betteraves, je vais en prendre aussi.
Did you hear it? Yeah. So he actually repeats the same phrase again. The first time he doesn't have a fricative, the next time is a very pronounced fricative. So that's a really cool contextual cue. So for those of you that do phonetics, what we like to do is make recordings and then put it through a computer program and look at which frequencies have the loudest amplitude. So what you're seeing here is frequencies sort of spread out, lower frequencies down here, higher frequencies up here, and the dark parts are where you get loudness. And so what I want to point your attention to is this final oo vowel or u vowel, and you'll see that in the vowel part where it's voiced, you have a darkness down here, but you see that voicing goes away, and what you get instead is loudness at these higher frequencies. That's that friction that you're hearing. Friction has kind of a hissy sound to it because it's a higher frequency than the rest of the vowel. So I'll play this for you. Just listen to the very last vowel of the last word. It's the word vaincu, and the u will be devoiced. Oh.
Venu, vu, vaincu.
So this is effectively what you're hearing when you hear friction. The question I get all the time is this a French thing, or like, what is this? Can this occur in other languages? Like, why French? And it's a great question. There is a conspiracy of 3 different articulatory features that allow it to be something that can exist in normal articulation. And then what we see here is evidence that it's been reappropriated into the social realm. So with French, we have this element of constriction. So you notice that I'm always talking about EU and OO vowels. In French, those are high vowels. So they're not exclusively in high vowels, but they're most common among high vowels. The reason being, when you articulate high vowels, your mouth is closed. So think about an open vowel, a low vowel, like an ah, and you've got your mouth open and there's this big hole for air to escape through. When you pronounce an E, and OO, you have the smallest possible opening for that air to rush out of. And what that does is it forces the air to make contact with your lips and your teeth, and that's where you get the friction from. So that's why we're having this in French. In languages where you don't have this really fixed note of constriction, or in vowels that are more open, you're less likely to have that pressure as the air rushes through that small cavity. As you're speaking, the reason we call it phrase final, just naturally as you're speaking, you kind of run out of steam, and so that's normal. But it's the intersection of running out of steam with French being a language that puts emphasis, marks stress at the end of the phrase. So languages like English will say, oh, there's words, and we're going to always accentuate certain syllables of words. French doesn't care about words. It just groups a bunch of things together, and then the very last syllable of whatever it is going to be what gets the emphasis. It's this final lengthening, this need to mark emphasis at the end of the breath group that causes this to be a thing. So if you want to have fun, if you like to do mouth gymnastics, you can set yourself up to do this. You can articulate an ooh or ooh, run out of steam, ooh, and then think, oh no, I have to mark emphasis, ooh. And what you end up with is this push through a very small opening, gives you friction on your lips and your teeth. This actually exists in other languages, so Kinyarwanda has it, Korean has it. It does exist in other places, but this is, from my research, seems to be the place where it's existed in the social scene most predominantly. There has been a lot of work phonologically to see like just where this can occur, and I won't talk a lot about it, but I'll tell you that I've already told you it's most common in high vowels. That doesn't mean you can't get it elsewhere. You can even get it on nasal vowels in French, so it's just much less common. It's more common in read speech versus impromptu or conversational speech. It's more common after syllables that start with stop consonants, so p, t, k, b, d, g, things like that. Then after like nasal consonants, m, n, or liquids like l or h. It's common intonation phrase finally, that's why we call it phrase final, fricative epiphysis. And it's also the most common at the ends of declarative sentences versus WH questions or yes-no questions. The reason being in French, when you get to the end of a declarative phrase, you drop your intonation, and so that sets you up perfectly for this final push, if you will, for the frication. And it's also been found to have a lexical effect, so it's more common actually in words that are more frequent. So there does seem to be some kind of lexical effect. The social patterning of this variable is kind of complicated, which invites the participation of sociolinguists like me. Early work associated it with, and I want to say associated with because there wasn't a lot of differential methods used to assess. It was originally associated with women, but then later work found that that wasn't exclusively the case, so men do this too. It was at once associated with the middle class, la bourgeoisie. It was associated with peripheral age groups. So this particular study had 3 cohorts of older, middle, and younger age speakers, and it was found that the youngest and the oldest groups produced it at the highest rates. At one point it was thought to be Parisian, but then not, because later work showed that it was also found in the speech of speakers who lived in other metropolitan cities in France, so like Lyon and Strasbourg. And then at one point it was located in an individual sector. Like, this is a news anchor thing. And we find it among news anchors who speak French regardless of where they are. They can be Canadian French speakers, they can be Belgian, they can be from France. This is a news anchor thing. News anchor thing because they read off teleprompters, so they're using this read speech in a conversational way. And then someone said, you know what, it's not just news anchors in general, it's young news anchors. And that's super weird, right? It's a dog whistle for inexperienced, because they see it as a verbal tick that you wouldn't necessarily want in careful French, which is ironic because when we get to the perception data, we'll find something else. But yeah, so what they're saying here is basically news anchors who don't know how to read effectively off of a teleprompter. And then it's actually been found among advanced second language speakers. So people like me and a lot of my colleagues who use French, we're not native speakers. We use it at a very high level, but we've acquired it as adults. So you won't be surprised necessarily to find out that there are differences in the way second language learners of French use this fricative than native speakers. And so it turns out there's two kinds of differences. There's differences in how often they produce the fricative, and then how long the fricative is when they produce it. So do they say oui with a short one, or do they say oui with a really long one? In terms of how often they produce it, it was found that actually second language speakers use it more than native speakers, which is comical, and we'll look at that. A more nuanced study found that actually they use it at about the same rates in terms of like statistics, but it turns out that they're motivated by different factors. So second language speakers are really focused on formal tasks like word list reading and things like that, and first language speakers are really sensitive to pragmatic directives like context or role plays, where they have some contextual thing that would force them to want to use it. In terms of duration, we find something similar. Native speakers are really sensitive to pragmatic shifts, such that when they're using more formal speech or speaking more slowly, they produce fricatives that are actually longer in length. Second language speakers don't pay attention to pragmatic shifts at all. Again, they're really focused on the task. So if you ask them to read a word list, which is a very artificial language activity, it comes out all over the place. But if you ask them to have a conversation, it doesn't necessarily show up at the same rate. Among second and native speakers, we didn't actually find any effects for gender and age. So in this regard, it's the same. So the first task I'm going to report on today is a perception task. It's a matched guise task, which means that speakers were told to listen to a bunch of different people, but the different people weren't really different people. It was the same few people speaking in a couple of different ways. And one of the ways that they were speaking didn't have any fricatives attached to it. So it was the null condition. Then there was a situation where they were using the fricatives in the places where you would expect them, and they were average length fricatives. They were just average for that vowel. And then there was a long condition where you would use the fricatives, and the fricatives would be, it's not ridiculously long, but they would be the mean length plus 3 standard deviations. So it was still natural for people to listen to. It sounded like natural French, but it was measurably longer. We had 75 speakers of, this means continental French, so they were speaking French from France, the hexagon, and they were across the ages. They were asked to rate the voices they were listening to according to 32 adjectives of register, of stance, affect, speech rate, personality, and listener identity, and they rated them on a 1 to 7 Likert scale. And then we used a method called exploratory factor analysis. I won't belabor the stats because who wants that, but if you have questions, let me know in the Q&A. And what I did was I looked to see, among these 32 adjectives, which ones got rated in similar ways. And you can actually group them together into clusters and determine that people are associating certain adjectives with one another based on their rating ability, based on the way they score them. It won't surprise you to find out that native and second language speakers don't perceive this variable the same at all. Actually, second language speakers get exactly half or slightly half of the full perception. So second language speakers perceive this fricative to be a marker of traits of admirability and formality. And I'll show you what that is on the next slide. Whereas native speakers perceive it to be a marker of admirability, right? But then it also has this double life as a marker of intense affect. So affect that can sometimes be positive and it can sometimes be negative. So, that doesn't look good at all. These are the adjectives that were loaded into the group. So I told you that there were 2 groups that formed for each of the speaker groups, and then the adjectives that were rated similarly grouped together in them. You'll see here, just descriptively, if you just look at this, you'll see that among native speakers in this particular category, there are many, many, many more adjectives than in the second language group. This isn't uncommon. This means that there's much more of a consensus among native speakers about what this means, so they have a much clearer idea. And if you think about second language speakers and their own individual experiences in the language community, that makes a lot of sense. So the adjectives that got grouped together were things like, this person is well educated, they're professional, they speak clearly, they're polite, confident, I believe what they say, I would like to speak like them. This is the one that I've labeled the admirability factor. So I'm using big letters just so you know it's not the real word, but this is an umbrella term that I've tried to assign to this particular factor. This other one is a really interesting one, the intense affect factor. It includes adjectives like, this person is aggressive, they're bourgeois, they're superficial, they're bossy, they're a native speaker. That was a fun one to ruminate on. They speak with emotion. And then among second language speakers, you see this is an actual subset of the first group. So we have 4 adjectives here. I call it admirability light. We just have confident, persuasive, I respect the speaker and I trust them. And then you see in the second factor, we actually have 3 of the adjectives that did load in the big factor for native speakers. So they are getting at this careful reading of it, but they're not necessarily associating the 2 together because they're reading them differently. And then we have the addition of this person speaks formally. So this is the one that I call features of formality. So, okay, great. So it seems that this variable is salient. People hear it. We've got this noise at high frequencies. They know it's there, and they're trying to make sense of it. Men and women are using it across the ages. It marks formality and admirability, and then among native speakers, it marks intense emotion. And so then the social scientists ask herself, where else could I go to find data where people might use these features, where they posture, and where they show intense affect? And so the obvious answer is social media or Twitter, right? Twitter is like, nope. Yeah, so the question answered itself. So then I did. So I went to Twitter, which is a great place to go for this kind of stuff. It just was like a little package wrapped right up. You need people behaving emotionally. Like I'm not there every day anyway. So what I did was I mined Twitter. I used a package called Twitter. I don't know how to say it, but it's Twitter with a big R because we use it in the R interface, RStudio, which is a statistical package. And what that allows you to do is pull data. The downside, so I pulled from July 2019 to March 2021. The downside to this is that it's a live API, which means that you can't pull old data. You can only pull within about 3 days of the moment you start asking for data. So I wanted to make a comprehensive database of all of the instances that I could find like ever since Twitter existed, which isn't that long. So I actually had to use another method to get old tweets, which is Twitter's advanced search. You can automate that. And I pulled all the way back to November 2009. So provided that the method is sound, we'll talk a little bit about what it is. I should have a fairly comprehensive record here of this kind of variable on Twitter. I targeted France in the code, so I put the geographic center of France, which is these GPS coordinates, and I asked it to pull tweets that were composed and posted within a 300-mile radius of it. So it's not exact, right? Because there's stuff in the ocean, and then there's countries on the inside, but tweets that were composed in French and posted from this location. I used a method called snowball sampling where it required me to do a little bit of qualitative work to find out what were the different ways in which people represented this feature in writing, because this isn't conventionalized in any kind of way. And so it turns out that you could find it in tweets represented with an H, with an SH, with a CH, and with a CHE. And if you know anything about French orthography, the CH and the CHE aren't really surprising. That gives you a sh sound, and so that's more or less how people perceive this a lot of the time. I started with the word for yes, which is 2 things. It's a really frequent word, and it's also the only word in the literature on this variable that's ever shown signs of lexicalization of this variable. And what that means is when a word is lexicalized as a phonetic variable, that every time someone would say that word, they would automatically say it with this feature. So you can look at little kids learning French, and sometimes they'll always say wish, 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 because they think it's part of the word, right? They think it's a phony, and realize that it's social. And so there's been some evidence of that. So I thought that would be a really good place to start. I used this snowball sampling method where you basically take the word and you search all of Twitter for each of the possible grapheme suffixes independently. So I pull all the tweets that contain we with an H, and then all the tweets that contain we with an SH, and a CH and a CHE. Within those tweets, you very rarely find just one word that has this fricative on it. So you'll find one that has like 2 more words in it. And then what I would do is pull those words individually, and then I would search for each of them with each one of the suffixes. So it's this big snowballing thing where you're constantly looking for more words that are implicating more words that are implicating more words. That gave me a huge list of words, surprise. And then I had to compare it with the dictionary, because it turns out there are some actual words in French that like just end in these sounds. Like quiche is a real word, and it has nothing to do with this project. So that gave me a data set of about 2,000 tokens. So you can see that we've got like 12 years. So it's not very predominant, but there are several instances of it. Of the 2,000 tokens, it was about 1,800 tweets. made by 1,700 tweeters that comprised about 300 lemmas, so 300 different words. So my research questions were, does this variable occur primarily in tweets that exhibit traits of the stuff we found in the perception task? So I'm trying to test what I found in perception to see if this is true, because it's borne out in Twitter data. You'll notice that I put admirability in a different color here. Admirability being something that's largely subjective. There's no way for me to assess in an objective way what one person finds admirable. So I left it out of this analysis. And I focused instead on formality and intense affect, and those two categories can be signaled by, in particular, these adjectives that loaded in the factors, so politeness, markers of confidence, markers of aggression, markers of bossiness, and then emotionality. Once I did that, I wanted to find out, do men and women do this at the same rate? So there's been all this talk of, oh, this is a woman's thing. Well, let's see if there are any kinds of data to support that. So I wanted to see if men and women were observing these categories at the same rate. Then I wanted to look and see if the word that had the fricative, if its location in the phrase mattered. You recall that we call this phrase final fricative epithesis because in speech that's how it seems to pattern, given all of the intonation things about French. But nobody's speaking here. This is Twitter. So we wonder if maybe the positionality mattered. And then I also wanted to look at the lexical frequency to see if there were any frequency effects, given that there had been frequency effects also. So I coded each of the data for these 4 things. Tweeter gender sounds straightforward, and it was super not, because if you know anything about French grammar, you know that there's not an established way to represent non-binarity, and one of the main ways that people do represent non-binarity is through alternating masculine and feminine accords. So what I had to do was basically qualifies as like low-key stalking of people tweeting. I had to go to their profiles, and I had to see how they talked about themselves in French, which kind of adjectival agreement did they use, people talking about them, did they ever talk about them in a place where they could confirm or disconfirm that. This actually took a lot of time, but it was interesting, and what I found out was that we didn't have, in this particular sample, I didn't find evidence of non-binary speakers, but given in mind that this goes all the way back to 2009 when people didn't readily indicate their pronouns necessarily in those settings. So I think if you review the sample now, and you do find lots more like overt representation of these kind of things. Then I coded for where the item was in the tweet, if it was at the end of a constituent or not at the end of a constituent. Again, I'm only really focused on finality. Constituency here really has to do with breath groups, so things that structurally go together and things that you would intonate in the same breath. Then I looked at pragmatic category of the tweet, so was it formality, was it intense affect, was it something else? And then I used this method of lexical frequency, which is a continuous variable. It actually is kind of counterintuitive. The most frequent word has the score of 0, and then the least frequent word has a score of 24. So we're on this really small, reduced scale that's inverted. So the lower the number, the more frequent the word. So what did we find? It turns out that formality was represented in the tweets. About 5% of the data was representations or instances of formality. Intense affect really stole the show. 92% of the tweets were some kind of marker of intense affect. Again, if you spend any time on Twitter, that will not surprise you. And then the other category was about 3%. I want to point your attention to the sub-themes that emerged. So there were some sub-themes that came up in each of these categories. In formality, it was instances of people expressing thanks, asking for a favor, showing deference. In intense affect, there was a lot of instances of aggression or passive aggression, humor, and then fear, sadness. And then in the other category, there were instances of alignment, people trying to say, oh, I agree with you, people seeking alignment, people trying to like get people on board, and then disalignment. So I love numbers as much as everyone else, but I think the most illustrative stuff is in the tweets itself, so I'm going to share some tweets with you. I'll translate them if you don't speak French, don't worry. So this is an instance where this person says, oh, my favorite gift ever, thank you so much. And then you have the fricative on the word merci, the CH, and you have the fricative on the word beaucoup, CH. And he's talking about some Lego Eiffel Tower, I think. So he's just saying thank you. This person was in this really long, drawn-out debate with this other person who is in some kind of authoritative position, and finally she just defers and says, okay, Ms. President, like, I'll just do what you say, I'll submit. And so you see she puts the fricative here on the word for okay. This person is asking, this is kind of like one of those like slimy messages or like, take my survey, man. This guy saying, hey, I want to know about your gaming habits on your smartphone and on your tablet. It's a survey with a public result, takes about 5 minutes, it's for a friend, he puts the fricative on the word for friend, un ami, merci, and then he puts it without thanks. And so this is kind of a more professional inquiry, right? Like you're putting this out there for the masses.
But also we're buds.
Well, we're buds, but then vote. So vos attitude, right?
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, but I guess it's trying to group. So. This top license is actually a company, and so they're like, hey friends, like everybody knows each other. Does somebody know anybody who does screenwriting? We're looking for somebody. Thanks. Right? Just kind of like a general request and they throw that out there. This person is in this back and forth. They're saying, hey, can you tell me if the play was any good? And this guy says, yeah, okay. Using the CH. Ask me tomorrow in the afternoon. So they just kind of use it in this kind of exchanges. This is my favorite slide of the whole presentation because it is all tweets of intense affect. We'll start with this one. This woman is super passive-aggressive. She's on the train and she's mad because it's going slowly. She said, we should already be in Paris. We're still 20 kilometers away. Thanks a lot, SNCF. The SNCF is the train company in France. And so this, this thank you has got this fricative on it, but she's not really saying thank you. These two are pretty great. We'll start over here. So this guy's in a fight with somebody, and he ends up by saying, basically I'm going to throw bricks at your face, is what it literally means, but I'm going to shut you up by pitching bricks at you. So there's a lot of, you've got exclamation points, you've got the use of a word that means an animal's mouth instead of a human's face, and then they put the fricative here on the end of the word. So they're mad. This person doesn't even matter what they're saying. It literally doesn't matter, because first of all caps, so red flag number 1, red flag number 2, exclamation points, red flag number 3, who cares what the word means? Every single word ends in CH. And the funny thing is, like, you can't pronounce half of these words. So even if it were to be something you say out loud, unpronounceable. So this tells us, oh, we're in the situation of iDialect. There's something iconic about this variable in Twitter, if you can get it here, because there's absolutely nothing pronounceable about half of these words in spoken speech. If you want to know what it says, he says, oh, because I feel like it, now shut up, thanks a lot, I'm so classy. Like, he's in this argument about how fancy he is. This person is kind of like miserable and exchanging with this person back and forth. The exchange ends with cry with me, where you've got the fricative on the cry and the fricative on the me. And then this one is one of my favorites. So I don't know if you remember LMAO and LMFAO from like super old internet speech, like AIM days. So laughing line, I don't know what to say in the talk. And then, so in French there were 2 of them. There was XPDR, explosé de rire, which means exploded from laughter. And then there was another one, PTDR, pété de rire, which also means exploded from laughter. This person put them together, like into one big like fusion XPTDR. And then the fricative, and then the word yeah, or yes, and then So like functionally what you're supposed to take from this is that whatever the previous tweet was really funny. It's super funny. They're totally exploded from that. So then this other category is maybe less exciting. We've got a bunch of exchanges. It's more discursive, this alignment and disalignment thing. You've got a bunch of people who are having discussions. This person saying like, oh yeah, they make a point, and this person says, oh yeah, you're right. And then they say, maybe, but of course, and they put the CH here on this agreement. This goes on for several exchanges, and this is how it ends up. Here we have people debating on what kind of music they should play. And this person makes a joke about, oh, we shouldn't play this music because it's really going to kill the mood. And this person says, yeah, you're right. And so they use it here to sort of just put themselves in agreement with the other person. This seeking alignment is like, the way I imagine this is like a pep talk. So you're already in caps land, so the letters are all big again. We've got exclamation points. And they're really trying to pep talk this person by saying, oh, I would never say that, believe in yourself, never say never, okay. And you've got this sort of back channeling. You've got this back channeling fricative here, occurring on the word for okay. Disalignment, you've got this person giving like really specific information about hiking in some town, and this person says, oh yeah, you're right, I've heard of that place. And this is actually an instance of alignment. They're agreeing with this person says. And then this other person tunes in and is like, what? Like, whatever. This is the functional equivalent of like, yeah, right in English, like whatever you say. But I don't agree with you. I'm drawing a line between what you said and what I think. So then I decided to ruin things by doing a bunch of fancy counting, so running some statistics. And I won't go into the details, I just want to tell you what the findings were. I wanted to see if the pragmatic categories that we observed in the perception task were recognized, and so I looked to see how men and women and where the word and the phrase was, if that mattered, and I found no effects. So what that means is there's no difference between how men and women recognize these categories. They're able to both do the same. And there's also no effect for position, which means that phrase final fricative epithesis isn't phrase final on Twitter, not phrase final at all. So what I've done here is I've actually taken some example tweets and I've cut them up into constituents. Again, this goes along with how you would breathe and how you would structurally group them if you were going to say them out loud. And so we expect that we would get this in final position. We expect it here, we expect it here, we expect it here. But what we also find is an instance that's not final. This one, we have 3 constituents, we expect it in each of these final positions, but we get 1 here that's not final, and we get 3 here that are not final. In this case, we have 3 constituents, and we have an instance here of 1 that's non-final. So this is a new finding, and this is really evidence that we've got something iconic here. Within each category, I wanted to then see were men and women doing the same thing. So when you're talking just about showing formality on Twitter using this fricative, are they doing it the same rate? And then does it matter where in the phrase the word occurs? It turns out that women are about 50% less likely than men to use this fricative to mark formality. So we have an instance here that's fairly significant. So women are not using this as much as men to mark formality. Intense affect, which is the other category, I ran the same test to find out that women were actually twice as likely, so 2 times more likely than men to use it to mark some kind of intense affect. Everyone is smiling. This is a finding that makes me very nervous because there are lots of generalizations to be drawn on it, but it does seem here from this data that women are more likely to use this to mark intense affect than men. Lexical frequency, I wanted to see if there were differences here and if the word was common or not and whether or not the word occurred at the end of the phrase. And I found 2 things. Women are generally using the fricatives on words with lower frequency. So they're not sensitive to lexical frequency in the same way men seem to be. And words in general that are in final position, remember this axis is inverted. So the lower the number, the more frequent the word. Words that are in non-final position are much more frequent, actually about 2 points lower, so much more frequent than words that are in final position. So there does seem to be both a gender effect here and a location effect. So what did we find? The pragmatic categories were supported. I'm not really in love with the analysis of the other category because we have instances of a thing and then the inversion of that thing, and to me that doesn't seem to go together. And so I'm looking at other ways to analyze that. I'm considering sentiment analysis, which is where you actually consider the words that are in the tweets, and each of the content words gets a score based on like a 6-point scale that tells you if it's a positive tweet or a negative tweet. There might be some insight to be gained there. This is, however, the first gender-based difference that's ever been found in the history of this variable, where we do have men showing a preference for marking formality and women showing a preference for marking intense affect. This might be reflective of how different genders perform in online spaces. I don't want to make that claim. It might just be reflective of how human beings act online. There's a different level of accountability, and so then people express in a different way. It does seem to be that this is not bound to the end of constituents and vernacular writing. Most of our tokens here were instances of the word yes, the word yeah, no, thank you, or okay. Again, a lot of this, what we've seen is that this is an instance of iDialect. They're using it iconically. It's almost like an emoji that just happens to look like letters. And so this is unclear if there's some kind of structural loosening happening, like this is going to happen in spoken French. We don't really know that. We don't have that kind of data. It could just be that it has its existence here. Lexical frequency seems to play a role, but just for men. This may be a situation like we see a lot in sociolinguistics where you have women leading the change of some kind of sound change, and they may be loosening the constraints because they are using this variable with less frequent words. We also have to ask ourselves a question, is this iconic? Is this going to say specific to this genre of text, or is this something that is a preview of some change that's happening that's going to come in spoken French? Our project I'm working on now is to figure out if the way that speakers represented the fricative tells us something about them. So our most common allograph as we call it, was some number of C's, some number of H's, and maybe an E. Following that was some number of H's, and then after that we had some number of S's and some number of H's. And so I think that the allograph choice might tell us something about Tweeter identity. If not identity, then definitely something about stance. So we'll just wrap up by talking a little bit about persona. So a lot in sociolinguistics, we work on this climb of something that's an indicator that kind of flies below the radar, something that's a marker that people hear and they know what it means, and then something that's a stereotype that doesn't vary necessarily in terms of geography or something like that, but that actually indexes a very particular kind of person. I think we're still in marker status with this particular variable, but we're starting to see different persona emerge. So we have this person here talking about a sweet little baker lady who always says, "Have a nice day," and "thank you," using the fricative. This person's talking about, with a dismissive way of talking about women, like, "Oh yeah, I know chicks who do that." He's kind of used a not nice word for girls. And this person replies by saying, "Thank you," and uses the variable. "Yeah, you got it right," and uses the variable. We're total losers. Thanks, have a great day, right? So she's sort of trolling him, for her. This person says, "Oh, I have a cousin." She puts this everywhere when she sends text messages, like on the word "okay" and on the word "kisses," and she's like, "I just don't get it. This person doesn't understand." And then this woman who's having a terrible train ride, apparently it was really bad, because here she is again. She's saying every time the person comes to stamp your ticket, every time they take your ticket, they say "thank you," and they put this fricative on the end of it. So. And then this person is talking about the persona of a teacher. So it has a teacher who every time they speak, they end their phrases with this sound, and so the student wants to troll the teacher by asking them to say words that actually end with the sound to see if they say wow, she, sure. They say it twice, or they just don't say it. There's also, for sociolinguistics sake, there is a lot of meta-linguistic commentary out there, which can be good or bad. It's interesting because this is the kind of stuff we would love to harvest from our participants, and it's also a little bit heartbreaking because you see how judgmental and stigmatized a lot of this is. This person is like, "PSA, hey people who put this fricative at the end of your sentences, stop, you guys sound really dumb." And then she says "thank you" with the fricative. This person, I don't know, Star Wars fans, apparently Darth Vader says no with the fricative in episode 1. I haven't looked this up to see if it's true. So there's something there about that. This person is describing reality TV, so they're describing this person on a show, and this one woman apparently says it when she says the word for lunch, when she says the word for "thank you, and then this woman gives this really terrible evaluative sentence. "These language tics make you want to vomit." It's just like this other person, this other redneck who says "et bonjour" all the time. So you have this really negative stigma that's emerged surrounding this sound. This person down here says the same thing. Basically, people who say this or use this speech, they're worse than people who say "du coup," and "du coup" is like the French "and then." So it's like "and then," "and then," "and then," and then it's this thing that people do. If you take away one tweet from this, it's probably this one. I don't know what this means, but I love sharing with people. This person says, "My ex, she used to write 'yeah' with this fricative. I left her immediately." So I don't know what that means. I have an idea. But there's a story in there. So our conclusions, this is not just a hiss. Sometimes it gets dismissed as sound. This is a social, pragmatic, phonetic feature. It's sensitive to pragmatic directives. You find it in speech and tweets of men and women across all the ages. It's associated with France, but not uniquely. It occurs often in contexts of formality and intense affect. It's salient enough to have a written form. It's starting to occur regularly outside of final position, at least on Twitter. It's handled differently by men and women on Twitter according to word frequency, and we're starting to see signs of stigmatization by native speakers. And so this tells us that we are definitely in social market territory, but probably before long we'll be in stereotype territory. So I just want to show you a little bit about how I like to teach my students about this. So I've broken it out here using sociolinguistic terms, but I know a lot of you work in multi-literacy frameworks, and so the translation isn't that far away. So what you can ask them to do to just sort of sensitize them to something like this is play the clip like I played for you, and you give them basically what I call a phonetic close test. So you give them the text and you say, describe what you hear. Do you hear something? There's something there. You kind of cue them up to the fact that they should be hearing something. And you ask them to try to spell it with French letters. What's cool about this is that you can do this in French 1 on the second day, right? So you don't have to know much to be able to hear these really binary sounds. Once the students get a little further with it, or that you're able to contextualize it, you can ask them to do sort of their own match guys, ask them what the difference could be between these two pronunciation styles. Here we have two instances of the exact same phrase. He says it here without, and he says it here with. And so you can let them use the context to see, like, this person says what? Oh, could it be a situation of clarification? And then they can understand that this is the way that you show emphasis, mark emphasis in French. You can ask them what the context is here, like, who are these people? Can you imagine other settings in which you might use this sound? And then, of course, my favorite is always the actors' workshop. Once they've really tuned in on this and heard it and studied it and looked at the text, you ask them to reenact the scene with a partner. And you tell them, monitor your pronunciation because your goal is to speak as clearly and politely as possible. And if they haven't gotten that this is a marker of clearness and politeness from the activity, then you've basically told them there. By then, you're like, here's what it means. If you use like an iceberg or something with your students, I often just like throw a tweet and let them try to figure out, like, oh my gosh, what are we looking at today? So you can start with a tweet and have them just sort of examine it in the same kinds of ways. So do you see any unexpected forms in this tweet? Which forms do you see? Where does the unexpected sound appear? So you sort of point them to the phonology, where in the word, after what letter, where in the phrase. You ask them how you might pronounce it, how else you can write it. Then you ask them to kind of zoom out, like, what's the tone of this tweet? What evidence do you find for register? And then the big question, like, why would the tweeter change their spelling? And that's a much larger question, which is, why do you change your spelling when you write tweets or text messages anyway? What does that signal? And then, of course, you let them write a tweet. So write a tweet. Ask the Twitter sphere for a favor. Change your spelling of relevant words. So if you clued them in well to the phonology up here, here it's just after the letter I, then they can go through and use words that this will likely occur in. So my point is basically, I do a lot of sociolinguistic research, but I'm also really interested in how people learn language, and so I really think that we should stop dividing sociophonetic competence from linguistic competence. I get tired of hearing about hard categories because there are just many categories. I'm not sure that some are more valuable than others. If we look at variation, the argument for studying sociolinguistics anyway, the variation that we find isn't noise to be like put on the sides. It's actually representative of the speakers of those languages, and so we really should tune into that because they're just as meaningful as the language forms. I argue all the time about text. Colleagues like to use formal text, but I'm a huge fan of social media, digital vernacular, text messages, Reddit forums. They're messy. Sometimes they're complicated. Sometimes there's a lot of support you have to do to give them, but they're really interesting because they're a genre that we're using outside of our lives as language teachers and learners. And then, of course, digital vernacular, which gets kind of poo-pooed because it is not formal and it does not follow the prescribed norms, is actually really telling, and we do well to listen to it. If you pay attention to the variation in all of these tweets, even if it's like one letter S or one repetition of the letter H, every single instance of that tells you something about the speaker's stance or their identity. So there's value in all of that. So I'll stop there. This is the word, for those of you that don't blind read spectrograms, this is the word merci with a really long fricative at the end to express how grateful I am that you listened. And if you want to talk more about this, if you like my slides, you can email me, you can get at me on Twitter, or you can come visit me in the Language Center because I love talking about this kind of stuff. Thanks so much.
We're officially at time, but I'm sure folks have questions, so please feel free to stay and chat with Amanda. I know I have questions, but no, I'll just start.
Rick?
I have to go teach, so I'm going to take my shot and then I'm going to leave. But
So should I not answer it?
it's just that the fact that the L2 speakers were using it more than the L1 speakers, if you go back to Labov and Martha's Vineyard, there's a study on some old fishermen used.
Yeah, no, I know it. The centralized diphthongs.
Everybody else.
Yeah.
I know you know. Some diphthongs. And the high school students who were planning to stay on the island and become fishermen used that a lot. And the ones who were planning to move to the mainland after graduation did not. But the people on the island that used it the most were the Portuguese immigrants who wanted to be like.
Exactly. Hypercorrection.
Hypercorrection.
Yeah, that's what this is.
So that's my my whatever.
You're right. Yeah, I totally agree with you. That's also my interpretation of it. It's actually really funny because native speakers know it to have this other meaning, and so you can take a really well-intentioned second language speaker who's doing all the right things and speaking with this like very careful French, and they use it too much, and the native speakers are like, "Is everything? What? Are we okay?" I've seen it a million times, and it cracks me up because I'm like, they crossed the threshold, and it just happened, and I don't know why it just happened, and they think were they mad? Like, what is that? And you're like, no, they only think it's formality. They were just trying to
clueless.
That's what this is.
That's interesting. Speaking of it as a marker of formality, I'm curious, like, what do you make of the fact that even L1 speakers see it both as a marker of formality and admirability, but also it's starting to become stigmatized?
Well, so think about, I think it's a fine line, right? Think about the kind of interactions you might have. Formalized interactions where you're like, "Oh, I'm so happy to help you today," like something like that. It's a fine line between putting on like a game face and a formal, I'm thinking of like a service industry.
So it's sort of like a fake.
Exactly, it's not authentic. So we're putting on the line, we're saying all the right things, we're using vous, I'm doing this very careful pronunciation, but I'm actually saying like, I literally would rather be doing anything in the world than helping you right now. And here's how I'm going to show it. Merci. Right? Like, thanks for coming. It's nice to see you anyway. People on the screen can't see my eyes, but they're. Yeah, I think that's a fine line. And, historically people say, like, where did this come from? I think it probably did start in a very earnest place of marking formality and careful French, because you're showing, I have this very articulate pronunciation, I'm maintaining my vowel constriction, I'm not diphthongizing, I'm doing this very performative whatever. And then I think very easily that can, like, switch over to, it's like not cool.
It could also be like stuck up, sort of.
It's very stuck up. Yeah, I think that's what comes into this like native speaker. You're aggressive, you're bossy, you're bourgeois.
Right.
If you ask people to rate native speakers and what they think, a speaker from France might sound like, I think a lot of those adjectives pattern together. And so there's this whole idea of like, what are they getting at? This is really about that. Yeah.
Merci. Merci.
Hey, vous direz rien. Je vous en prie.
So I have a question. I was wondering about the difference between this and like when people add schwa.
Schwa tagging?
Yeah.
It's the exact same intonation domain. So what I mean is it's always final. It's always at the end of the breath group. I don't know how that's perceived. I haven't seen, I think she's a music Copenhagen, right? The woman who researches this a lot. But it's in the same exact prosodic location. And so there was a question of if you could have both at the same time. And I did see some data where you actually got both. So it would be bonjour. Yeah, it was cool. Because it's a mid-vowel. I don't know how that's perceived. But I can think people could argue that it is also a marker of emphasis in the same way that it can be a marker of emphasis, like we saw with I'm going to have Beats guy.
And so would like that, the schwa thing, and then the antithesis thing, would that be similar to like in English people writing by with multiple e's on the end, or that's not really articulated, is it?
It can, I think people say bye. Yeah. I don't know if that came from people saying it emphatically and then writing it, or people writing it and then saying it like they write it. I don't know what the directionality is of that. But, yes, so there's other research. Actually, I'm going to point you to, in fact, if you like this kind of stuff, there was a special issue that came out that I edited this summer about French variation in digital media. And what you're talking about, Kate, was letter repetition. And you can actually look at the letters that are repeated, and you can actually tell what dialect of French someone speaks. Because if you look at, like, in the South where they articulate those final E's, they're more likely to repeat those E's in writing because they're pronounced. If you look at someone from a variety that doesn't even pronounce that, they're never going to write an extra E on the end of a word like that, because that sound, as far as I'm concerned, isn't there. And so this is a study that you might want to read. But, maybe. I think so. I just don't know if it has the same social value. I don't think that necessarily represents formality, but it might represent affect in that way.
So Polly's got her hand raised. I can unmute her.
I think you may have said I could ask my question.
Thank you for a really stimulating talk. It was really interesting for a lot of reasons, and I'd like to talk to you about it sometime. It reminds me a lot of the Japanese situation where the language learners come back with the voicing of a final deep voice. It's normally whispered or vowel, and I've always wondered where they get that, and especially because in my spontaneous conversational data, you don't find it. So they're getting it somewhere in a different sort of, and maybe, I don't think it's Twitter because this has been happening for years. But anyway, I also was very interested in the way you were mentioning this happened to be something that was finalizing something in conversation. And typically what happens in conversation is there's a need to indicate where a transition relevance place for a term to come up would be. In English, we often use the pitch peak. So if I'm saying something like, and she took a course with an expert in Shakespeare. With the shake there, that little rise there is often an indication of nearing the end of the boundary there. So I wondered if you thought at all about whether this was something that would mediate turn taking. And the other question I had, I'm much more in the conversational area right now, so that's why my questions are related to that. But I was watching the video, and I wondered if someone uses that, is there something nonverbal that happens? The one with the whatever it was, pardon my French. I noticed the guy that was eating, he had his eyes were open and closed, but he like raised his eyebrows. And I was just wondering if there's any sort of non-verbal thing that accompanies this as well.
Yeah, okay, great question. So let's take the first one, turn taking. Yes, absolutely. I think the reason that you find this most often at the end of declarative sentences and at the end of intonational phrases is because there's a low tone in French, so that they generally add on a low tone. And so we talk about low tones and you talked about pitch peaks. And this is just something that happens in it, so you would normally get the low tone, and so now you get part of a low tone or a low tone and the fricative. And so it basically signals, just like you said, this is the end of my turn. That doesn't mean that it's the end of the utterance, like the utterance can go on, and so I actually inserted some things for you in the tweets because I didn't want to show you like 17 back and forths with people, but they use them in sequence, so you can use it and then have the discussion thread still go. But it does mean I'm giving you the floor, if that makes sense. So I think you're right. It does sort of follow intonation patterns, and for that reason, it is at the end where you signal, I'm done talking. What was the other question? Gesture. That's a good question. I think in this particular case, French speakers, I think, can assess it. It's kind of a weird and meaningless exchange that these men are having in this excerpt that I showed you. And I think the reason he raised his eyebrows is because he was like, literally, I don't care that you're eating beets, and I also don't need to know that you're also going to have some, so why are you telling me this? The subtext is that Gerard Depardieu is trying to make nice with this guy because he has heard that the man thinks he doesn't like him. And so I think more than anything, the eyebrow raising is maybe a reflex of, like, why is this exchange even happening? I don't need to know this information about you, person I don't even know. Eat whatever you want for lunch. But the idea of whether or not there is some kind of gesture is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I've never collected video data, but you will be very happy or very scandalous to know that I have spent many hours on TikTok in the name of sociolinguistic research. And I think you're right. I think maybe I should start paying attention to that dimensionality, because up until now there hasn't, to my knowledge, been any research that's looked at any kind of like concurrent gesture. So there may be something, particularly with the lips, because the lips are often the thing that are causing friction in the first place. Yeah.
Right. The other thing that people talk about in turn taking is sometimes you might extend your turn so you wouldn't have a pause in between your utterance and the next. So this could be a way of extending as well. And then, like you say, in sequences they might do this, but go on if the person doesn't, the other person doesn't respond. Twitter differently, but yeah. Thank you very much, and I'd love to talk to you sometime.
Sure, I've been meaning to meet you, so we should make it official.
Thanks for sticking it out.
Thanks for
coming.
coming.
Being patient with us.